Hello everyone, my name is Richard White and I'm Chief Operating Officer at Oxford Pharmagenesis, and it's a pleasure to present this update on transparency in real-world evidence. Today I'll be addressing some fundamentals of why transparency in RWE matters, and then going into more detail on what the key issues are and what's being done about them. First of all, very brief introduction to me. I'm a pharmacologist by training, and along the way I've added experience in marketing and health economics. A disclosure there, I'm a board director and shareholder at Oxford Pharmagenesis, and there I established our value demonstration practice, which is our team that specialises in HUR and real-world evidence. I've given presentations in this area at a number of conferences, and I'm delighted to add RWE 2022 to that list. So I'm going to talk first about why transparency in real-world evidence matters and what lessons we can learn from randomized controlled trials. Those of you who've seen me present before will know that I like to use the analogy of cars to explain these concepts, and we'll come back to this analogy a few times in the presentation. But when we conduct a randomized controlled trial, we're assessing the efficacy of a treatment under highly controlled conditions. Here we have the standing quarter-mile time per Porsche from the manufacturer's brochure. And this is measured under controlled weather and temperature conditions on a flat track with a test driver and so on. And so this is a bit like a randomized controlled trial where you have a limited, clearly defined patient population, inclusion and exclusion criteria, and so on. But of course, in the real world, Porsches are going to be used in all sorts of different situations that weren't covered in the official test. And there's some examples here. And so the effectiveness is going to be different, and that's what we're looking at with real-world evidence. Now, in talking about transparency, where I want to start is with an article that I wrote for the Journal of Comparative Effectiveness Research back in 2016, which talked about the importance of transparency to build trust in real-world evidence. This article highlighted several key challenges that researchers face with real-world studies, and we'll go through these today, but essentially they're twofold. There are challenges related to methodology, and in particular, the quality of the data and the lack of randomization. And there are also challenges related to the lack of trust in the pharma industry. And these are the same as those that we faced previously with randomized controlled trials. So over the past couple of decades, regulatory authorities have mandated registration of randomized controlled trials, posting of results summaries, disclosure of financial relationships, sharing of anonymized trial data, all because fundamentally there's been a lack of trust in the industry. And with randomized controlled trials, industry has built trust in their studies through transparency. So the key message here is that fundamentally we need to apply the same approaches for real-world evidence. With those principles in mind, let's go into some more detail on what are those key issues for transparency in real-world evidence and what initiatives are ongoing to address these. Something that's important to note is that real progress has been made since I wrote that JCER article back in 2016. There are many ongoing initiatives addressing transparency in real-world evidence that involve academic groups and regulatory bodies such as FDA and EMA. The RWE Transparency Initiative, led by ISPOR and ISPI, is one that we'll talk more about. And as part of that, RCT Duplicate is an initiative that addresses whether real-world evidence can be applied to reproduce randomized controlled trial results. And the REPEAT initiative aims to reproduce real-world evidence study results based on published methods. And the updates that I'll be presenting in this talk include the latest information presented at the ISPOR conference a couple of weeks ago. Now, we can summarize 4 major specific issues for trust in real-world evidence, and I'll go through each of these in some detail. But in brief, they are first a fundamental methodological issue, which is the risk of bias and confounding because real-world evidence is not randomized. Second, the quality and appropriateness of real-world data sources and whether the choice of data source is justified by the right reasons. Third, the multiplicity of studies, in particular, whether everything that is done actually gets published. And finally, the contradiction that real-world evidence studies can give different results to other real-world studies or randomized controlled trials addressing the same research question. The first issue we'll tackle is that real-world evidence isn't randomized. And if you don't randomize, there's a risk of bias and confounding. Here's another car analogy. The manufacturers of the Jeep Cherokee here show a real-world comparative study in which the Jeep covered a standing quarter mile quicker than the Porsche. So Jeep is faster than Porsche, right? You can probably all see the problem here. The Jeep's on a track, Porsche's on snow. So the surface is a confounder. Had we randomized so the conditions were the same, Porsche would have been faster, which is what we see here. So we need to be mindful of confounders, particularly when using real-world evidence for comparative effectiveness studies. So for this issue of the risk of bias and confounding, the key is transparency on methodology. We need to anticipate and address the steps that our real-world evidence study has taken to minimize issues such as selection bias, unmeasured confounders, bias in endpoint measures. The graphic here shows one such method, propensity score matching. There are many others. And new guidance is available here. The ISPOR-ISPI Joint Task Force has already published the START RWE template, which provides a more structured approach to developing and reporting real-world evidence study methodology. And hot off the press from ISPOR a couple of weeks ago was that a harmonized RWE study protocol template called HARPA is going to be published shortly in Value in Health. Here's a slide from the relevant ISPOR panel session that introduced HARPA. Essentially, HARPA extends the structured tables that were provided in START RWE and provides more free text entries that are found in some other templates, for example, those from EMA and ISPI. And that'll help harmonize entries without entirely reinventing the wheel. In the discussion, the panelists said that HARPA is being tested with HTAs, with payers, and with study registries. And look out for the published article coming soon. The next issue for real-world evidence is whether the choice of data source or setting is appropriate. So let's go back to our cars. Here's the standing quarter mile of a Jeep Cherokee in the snow. Here's the standing quarter mile of a Porsche in the snow. The Jeep's faster. So Jeeps are faster than Porsches, right? Of course, the answer is only in this setting, only in snow. And arguably, you wouldn't choose a Porsche driving the snow, so the setting isn't appropriate. And with real-world evidence, it's very important that the real-world data source is appropriate to the treatments you're looking at and the research question that you're asking. So for this issue of the appropriateness of the real-world data source, we need to show transparency in our data sources. Most real-world data are not collected specifically for the purposes of the analyses that are done on them. And so it's very important to show a clear rationale for the choice of data source. And if you ask top-tier journal editors to what is their main problem with real-world evidence studies, they'll reply that the authors really don't know enough about the quality of their data sources, how they were created and aggregated, and so on. And there are lots of aspects of data quality that we need to understand and communicate in order to build trust in those data. FDA and EMA are increasingly considering real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making, and both have been developing guidance on the use of real-world data in submissions. Again, an update from a relevant real-world evidence panel session at ISPOR a couple of weeks ago. In addition to several guidance documents that FDA put out towards the end of 2021, EMA has established a working party on real-world methods, which is going to provide guidance on methodology. And work has begun on Darwin EU. This is a federated network of national data sources in the EU based on a common data model that will be used for EMA decision-making. And transparency is going to be built into this initiative because there'll be access to use cases, how real-world evidence developed from Darwin EU is used in appraisals throughout a product lifecycle. More will be coming on both of these EMA initiatives throughout the rest of 2022. The next issue is related more to trust in industry than real-world evidence methodology per se. So let's go back to the car analogy. Here we have Porsche presenting the results of a study showing their car is faster than Jeep in a particular setting. But how do we know that Porsche didn't actually run lots of other studies in other conditions that showed Jeep was faster, but they simply chose to present the study that gave the answer they wanted? The trust issue here is that real-world studies can be much cheaper and quicker to conduct than randomized controlled trials. And so there's a suspicion that industry could do lots of studies and publish only those that gave the best results. Now, publication bias is a trust issue that we saw previously with industry-sponsored randomized controlled trials, and the solution is the same, and that's transparency and strategy. The ISPI Real-World Transparency Initiative recommends that what they call hypothesis evaluating treatment effectiveness studies, so that's studies that go beyond exploratory, should be registered and posted in a similar way to randomized controlled trials. And ISPOR and the Centre for Open Science have launched the first dedicated real-world evidence study registry, and there's now quite a few studies registered on there. Posting is not mandatory at present, but at ISPOR, both the FDA and EMA representatives on an RWE panel suggested that these HET studies should be registered in advance. And now this slide shows the URL for the RWE study registry. And you can see from the screen grab, it's a very straightforward portal with the sort of information you'd expect to include on something like clinicaltrials.gov. So the final issue for trust in real-world evidence, and therefore transparency of real-world evidence, is contradiction of study results. Again, for the final time, back to the car analogy, here's a study run by Porsche showing that their car is faster than the Jeep in a particular situation. But here's a study run by Jeep in a different situation showing that the Jeep is faster than Porsche. And this illustrates an issue that the results of a particular real-world evidence study may not be consistent with a randomized controlled trial addressing the same research question, or even with other real-world studies. It's therefore difficult sometimes for people to know if real-world evidence can be trusted. And this challenge of contradictory results can only really be addressed by transparency and reporting. It's essential to follow guidance on the reporting of real-world studies in the way that we'd follow now CONSORT for randomized controlled trials, and be as transparent as possible about the methodology. Researchers also need to do what they can to validate their findings, perhaps in different data sets, using sensitivity analysis, and not to overinterpret the results. Now, several ongoing initiatives are evaluating the quality of RWE reporting, the reproducibility of RWE studies, and also whether RWE can emulate results from randomized controlled trials. Now, here's a slide from a panel session at ISPOR recently, identifying some of the key challenges with randomized controlled trial designs that make them difficult to emulate using real-world evidence. And some of these challenges you can see on the screen, but they include things like run-in periods, discontinuation of baseline maintenance therapy. Now, the next slide is quite complex, but the takeaway message from this is that for randomized controlled trials that have few emulation challenges, the real-world evidence results can actually agree quite closely with the randomized controlled trial. On the other hand, and this is the red, where multiple emulation challenges are present, there's much less agreement in effect estimates between the randomized controlled trials and the real-world evidence. And actually, the different answers are probably correct because the studies are not answering the same question. Very interesting findings, and RCT duplicate is an ongoing program, so look out for further results over the coming months. Now, while talking about the latest updates from ISPOR, I draw everyone's attention to the new real-world evidence microsite that they've established. Evidence-Base is, of course, a wonderful repository for news and views on the latest in real-world evidence, and this ISPOR site is another place worth bookmarking. So before I close, I wanted to glance into the future of real-world evidence by talking about the 4 V's. We're really only at the beginning, and in the coming years, we'll definitely see a greater volume of real-world evidence studies, greater variety of real-world data coming from apps, wearables, social media, and so on. Higher velocity, results evolving in real time, and the need to communicate those dynamically. And also increased veracity through more interconnected data from multiple federated sources. And to wrap up, I'd like to leave you with something that I wrote in an article 6 years ago, but which I think still applies today. Building trust in real-world evidence is a task for us all. With access to potentially life-enhancing new treatments at stake, we owe it to patients to act together to build trust in real-world evidence through greater transparency. Thank you very much for your attention.